Welcome to my overview of reading poetry and how we're doing it for this unit of study, Artful Voices. I'm going to be giving an overview of what you should be looking for as you read poetry. And obviously, these are just suggestions. They're good techniques that work, especially if you need some guidance or some ideas about how to approach poetry. First thing I'm going to say is that poetry can be really intimidating because it requires the reader to really use their imagination and to visualize what it is that's happening in the poem and to use critical thinking skills and inferencing to kind of figure out, well, why the speaker would say these things or what these comparisons, similes, and metaphors would mean and whatnot. But the technique that I teach my kids is to apply lenses first as they're reading, and it might take a couple of readings for students and even myself to try to understand poetry. But we're going to start with the lenses that people, I suggest, look for and the types of questions that we should ask. So in the left-hand column here, the lens through which I'm approaching poetry, there's three basic categories of information I would be looking for. The first thing that I would strategically be looking for as a reader of poetry is the speaker and their intended audience. Who are they talking to? What kind of person is the one speaking, as well as the attitude that they use. So the type of questions that I would ask myself while I'm reading the poem is, who's the person speaking the poem? What's the persona? Sometimes the persona or speaker is different than the poet themselves. Sometimes poets take on the persona of somebody that isn't exactly them. Langston Hughes writes a series of blues poems. One of the blues poems, Langston Hughes takes on a female character. So sometimes, as you're reading, you have to make inferences about who's speaking, and that isn't necessarily the poet themselves. Not only that, then the next question would be, well, who would they be talking to? Sometimes everybody goes, well, they're talking to me. I'm reading the poem. They're talking directly to me. But sometimes there's a hypothetical person that they're speaking to who would be the recipient of the information that the speaker is trying to convey. And we have to kind of use our imagination sometimes to figure out who that is. Last but not least, when we read poetry, it helps to analyze what kind of tone they're speaking with. So when you're reading and you're trying to figure out what's going on, pay close attention to how things are being said. Is the person speaking in an educated tone? Are they speaking in a formal tone? Are they speaking in everyday language? Are they speaking using elevated diction and things like that? But the big idea is that we need to be able to look at who's speaking, who they would be speaking to, and the way in which they're speaking, the attitude with which they're doing it. These terms over here, I'll teach in more depth as we go forward throughout the course of the unit. But we're focusing right now on when we approach a poem, we should definitely be thinking about, well, who's talking, who would they be talking to, and what is their attitude. The second major lens that I encourage students to look through is, as they're reading, they need to be able to see the imagery and figurative language that is being used. In particular, when poets choose to use certain words that appeal to seeing, taste, hear, smell, and feel, they're doing so with a purpose. They're not doing it randomly. When you write a poem and you're the poet, you get to choose what's there, and you kind of are trying to give clues to a puzzle, and you want the reader to be able to figure them out. So one of the first things I encourage students to do is to ask themselves while they're reading, what can you see, taste, hear, smell, and feel when you read it? A lot of times the strategy we'll use is sketch to stretch, where we draw what we see in the poem as we're reading it. The second kind of thing in this category that we're looking for is, what do the images imply? What are they associated with? And this is where we start delving into things like figurative language, denotations, connotations, metaphors, and similes. We want to, as we're reading, strategically go, oh, that is a comparison of two unlike things, but why would the author use those things instead of say something else? So as a reader, we're strategically kind of looking for imagery and figurative language. Same thing is true as which comparisons are made and why. Why did this person choose to personify this idea? Why did the speaker choose to compare these two things? But this once again falls under the category of imagery and figurative language. So the first thing that we're always looking for is who's speaking and who would they be talking to. The second thing is what kinds of things can we see, taste, hear, and smell, and what kind of comparisons are being made, as well as the connotations or the big ideas and associations with those images, colors, etc. And that's worthy of its own presentation. The third thing that I encourage students to look for, the lens that I'm looking for, is patterns in the poem. When we see things repeated over and over again, like a single word, or we see a phrase, or we see a series of lines repeated over and over again, they did it for a purpose. Same thing is true for as you're reading it. If it comes to a nice end stop rhyme or that there's a rhythm to it, we want students to kind of notice those things and ask why the poet chose to do those things. Similarly, what kind of sound devices are there? Like when we listen to the poem being read out loud, what kinds of things can we hear as we're doing it? Is there a rhyme to it? Are the rhymes consistent? Or is there a pattern to it? Does the speaker use a lot of alliteration, like Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers or something like that? Another question that we want to ask is, do the lines have a pattern in the numbers of syllables per line, or do the lines have numbers at all? Do we have couplets? Do we have sets of four, which are known as quatrains? But we want students to ask, like, what are the patterns do we see, as well as like the stanza, or literally, like, how does the poem look when we look at it on the page? So this category is patterns in the poem, both sound devices as well as when we look at it, what do we see being repeated? What do we see how it lays out on the page? So essentially, the first step in reading poetry the first couple of times, if you want to delve to its deeper meanings, is to be aware of speaker, audience, and tone. Next is be hyper aware of the imagery and figurative language being used and really stop and take note and circle and draw whatever it is you're seeing in the poem. And last but not least is to be aware of patterns, whether it's in the sound of it, in the layout of it, or even if we see repeated words and phrases throughout a poem. But that is essentially one of the best ways to approach poetry is to kind of view through the lens. And lenses refer to strategically looking for specific sets of information. And once again, the first one is who's talking and who are they talking to? What kind of words and imagery and figurative language are they using? And last but not least, do we see patterns throughout? So these are the things I want students to be able to do and be aware of while they're doing it. And these are the types of questions I'd like for them to ask as they're approaching poetry. Thank you.